quickly, I'll go over the agenda, and I think most people know we're going to primarily focus on one cemetery street, but I'll go over this. We have a little bit of other business. So we'll call to order the meeting. The recording is already on, and so we'll make this available for folks who weren't able to join us or may just want to review it at a later date. It'll be posted on our website, and we'll send it out via email as well. Meetings are resuming, but we're still on an as-needed basis. And in-person meetings will resume when we can secure meeting space. It's likely to be back at the Marvin. I have a meeting with them, hopefully next week, coordinating that now. And we're going to look into how difficult it might be to try to conduct hybrid meetings with Zoom and in person, because at this point, it really would be ideal for us to do that. We had a lot of feedback from folks who weren't really able to participate in the past, to be able to, leave from home and be able to come to the public meetings, but they were able to hop on to Zoom from the comfort of their home. And so ideally, we'd like to have hybrid meetings going forward. So we'll keep you posted on that. Some new business, which is kind of old business, I just want to talk about for a minute here, because the idea is that we really need some volunteers. If you backtrack through prior emails, you'll see that there's a major I-95 reconstruction project underway that's going to be anywhere from 18 to 24 months. And very often their timelines are far off the mark. So if it expanded out to more than 2 years, I wouldn't really be surprised. But it impacts all of the properties on both sides of I-95, from exit 16 at the Yankee Doodle Bridge and the commuter lot, all the way up to exit 17, and then work that they're doing in Westport. It's the work that you saw us reference when we originally were coordinating with Stop I-95 Noise. And in our emails, you saw in the past couple of months that the governor and the DOT commissioner actually hit the pause button on the Greenwich portion of this project, in consideration of looking at improved roadway materials and barriers that would help to mitigate all of the noise that most people are subjected to if you live within, even a half mile of the highway. So there are some efforts that are going on in the background, coordinating with the new neighborhood association north of the bridge, the City Hall Neighborhood Association, and those folks, and some neighbors that are over on the Hendricks Avenue side of where it goes down to St. Anne's as well. Coordinating, communicating with elected city and state officials and appointed officials as well. And there's at least one petition circulating, and ENNA will be finalizing our version of a petition, getting board approval for that, and then hopefully getting that out by next week. The important thing here with a project like this, where we're looking for quick action from the state to try to help in terms of cutting down on the noise and the pollution from the highway, is that we do need volunteers for this project. And we asked a number of times starting back in October of last year. And we really hope that we can get a few folks to sign up for this. Ideally, we would need 3 or 4 people. And it would be helpful if we can get some folks to sign up. Just email us if you're interested, if you can help at all. We'll provide a list of things that we'll be looking for the volunteers to do. And then tonight we'll be focusing primarily on Wells Fargo, following last week's presentation by Spinnaker, Mill Pond Holdings, and what they showed you as I'll call them the preliminary plans, but as anybody who sat through that presentation can see, those plans are very well developed. And I guess there's some debate that we can have tonight as to just how set in stone that plan is, and what, if anything, people can modify to make it more amenable. When we get to that discussion, I'll explain in a minute why that project isn't going away. So we can kind of limit the conversation to rule out things like the city buying it to make it into open park space, or just to have a couple of single family houses on the parcel. And then I doubt if we'll have time permitting, but we always want to go back and kind of revisit the goal of ENNA and how this association is really just representative of all of the people that live in 06855 and supporting our neighbors that live across the bridge in 06851. But we really, really need people to help. We have a small all volunteer board, and without a lot of hands helping, we tend to not get as much accomplished as we'd like to. And then just along those lines, I just want to reiterate that even within our mission statement, just to remind folks that really what we want to do is encourage residents of East Norwalk to actively participate in achieving our goals, to maintain the character of our neighborhood. And participation can be in a number of ways that you can help, and almost limitless. And that's why we encourage you to write into us, and we can share all the ways that you can help. And we can talk about some of those tonight as well in terms of Wells Fargo. So what I'd like to do now is open this up for a general discussion on the presentation that we saw last week from Spinnaker. And that was on the August 3rd. For people who couldn't make it to that presentation, we did actually post the video. We didn't get the link from the developers until sometime on Friday, I believe it was. So we weren't able to get that out to folks until the weekend. If you haven't had a chance to review it, you can open your weekly email from ENNA and you can review the video presentation there. And I believe it's also posted on our website as well, which is eastnorwalk.org. So I see a whole bunch of folks here. If anyone has questions, what we're looking for really is to hear your feedback. We'll review this entire meeting so that we can put together some notes that would consist of comments, suggestions, concerns, anything related to that particular project. And then we'll be prepared to find what would be the best opportunity to relate that information back to the city, and possibly also another meeting with the developers as well.
Okay, Jessie has her hand up. I'm going to unmute.
Okay, I didn't want to get the ball rolling, but it seems like no one else is, so I'm jumping on in. First and foremost, thank you all for being here and making this meeting happen. I appreciate all that the volunteers do to keep East Norwalk lovely, because that's what we all want, and I much appreciate your time and efforts. Wondering a couple of things. I did attend the meeting, pardon me, with the builder, and I'm wondering what the next step is. We all kind of voiced a lot of strong opinions, and they got a lot of head nodding, but I want to know, where do we go from here? Did they agree to speak with us once again? Are they going to come back with some revisions? I didn't hear any definite anything, as if you had mentioned, Diane, that even the look of the buildings were more in par with the looks of the buildings closer to City Hall. And I agree, those big, they're lovely, but they're not East Norwalk. East Norwalk is definitely more beachy and nautical themed. I doubt that they're going to go back and change the whole look of the buildings, but was there anything that they had said that maybe I just missed it, that they had said, yes, we can bend on this, or we can work with you a little bit on this? Because I heard a lot of maybes, and I heard a lot of, well, it would be nice to do this and it would be nice to do that, but I don't know what that means. You know what I mean? So I'd like to hear some definites, and then what's the next step for them and for us to be able to come to some sort of common ground.
Okay, so I'll take that. Thank you, Jessie, for all of that. So I can't disagree with you. I think at the end of the meeting, I didn't have really a high comfort level that we really had nailed down what the next steps were, or what they intended to do with the information. I hadn't actually seen anyone taking notes, particularly as people were speaking. So it may be that they were themselves going to review everything afterwards. But I didn't really get a sense that there was a commitment for any particular item that was brought up. It was just more of just acknowledging that, that they heard what people said. In terms of the next step, I think kind of the ball is in their court to go back and digest what they heard, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then we didn't really leave it where they were coming back to ENNA, but I think that it's kind of, just a given that there ought to be some give and take dialogue on this. My concern is that, as I started out saying, that it seems that this plan is extremely well developed. So there's not a whole lot that can change in terms of the structure. There may be some slight architectural changes. They made those, already they've done one round on those. And I think that they may be having to modify some things when we finally get to see the traffic study. But beyond some cosmetic, aesthetic type things, I don't know what could change. I certainly wouldn't expect anything major to change. They're not likely to move any of the public realm to the front of the building.
Yeah.
I don't see that happening at all. I don't see them ponying up the funds to do the improvements that are actually on the city property that juts out into Mill Pond. They were only leaning towards we'll provide the right of way in order to provide access, but we're not paying for any of that. So I'm just not, I didn't hear or see anything that led me to believe that there was anything substantial to change.
So I'm not the only one. Okay.
Yeah. And I think we also went into this too for everyone who's on the call for the benefit of understanding the process, is that very often the public doesn't even see the extent of what you saw the detail on unless you're following zoning meetings, and a lot of people don't do that. And the first opportunity many of the public have to see these plans is actually at a legal public hearing. And you usually get one bite at the apple. It's, unless it's something very controversial, it's only one night. And by that point, it's set in stone. It's a done deal. They're really just going through the motions of approving something that's been well vetted by staff, for months and months. So, and I have the sense that that's the case here. ENNA, you may recall from a few meetings ago, we were reluctant to whether or not we were even going to participate, because we didn't want that community presentation from last week to simply be a check the box mechanism for the developer to say, well, we went out, we talked to the community, and a lot of people loved it, and they gave us some ideas, and we'll consider some of them. And the zoning commission then kind of just says, well, yeah, the community, they heard from the community.
Sadly, that's kind of what it felt like. And I do have one other question, because I'm really concerned about the wildlife on the Mill Pond. And I'm wondering, I really don't know the answer to this. Are there any regulations that they are required to follow? Certainly there must be, but who's in charge of that? I'm sorry, I'm very naive when it comes to these things, but it is a concern of mine, and I'm sure of others that live on the Mill Pond or in the area.
I think there's a few organizations. It will start with the Inland Wetlands Commission in Norwalk. And at the end of this presentation, when we go back to the agenda, I'm providing some emails for folks that can write into directly to the city organizations, to Planning and Zoning and the Conservation Commission and Inland Wetlands. In terms of actual protection of the wildlife, and this is where we can use some more volunteers as well. We were looking for people to start looking into whether or not there's any wildlife in Mill Pond that would be considered either endangered or on kind of the pre-endangered list, so that we could identify those to say any disruption of habitat or nesting could have a detrimental impact. In terms of the impact, like from the construction itself, I know a lot of us are concerned about that, because when you get into doing that amount of demolition and, construction and, digging into asphalt and hooking up the sewer and all of that, depending on what time of year they're doing it, it could be, disruptive to an entire cycle of wildlife.
Oh, without
And,
it.
and I think, like, I'm not quite sure, actually who can help us with that is possibly even the DEEP as well. And maybe even, save the sound and like the, I didn't really get a sense that the Norwalk Harbor Commission, they actually put their approval on this already. So we do need to look into that.
Yeah, if anybody else has any suggestions as to who might have a say in this, I would love to hear from that. And again, thank you so much. And I will gladly email whatever addresses you provide. And I hope others will too. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you. You're welcome. And I can say from my own personal experience too, back years ago when the city decided to drain Fitch Pond, which happens to be at the end of my street, that when they did all that work, there was great disruption to all the wildlife in the area. And there were birds, obviously they never returned because the pond was gone, but there was all kinds of wildlife that, it seemed like it took years to be reestablished in the area, just because there was just so much work going on and it was so disruptive.
Oh, I will share with this group, and then I promise I will turn the floor over to somebody else. I believe I mentioned it in the other meeting that I live right on the Mill Pond,
Right.
and when they dredged the pond, it took a good 10 years, 10 years
Right.
for the wildlife to come back. No kidding.
Right.
So it would be just awful if we had to go through that again. And if they come back, I hope they do. But
I do too, and I think it's one of the things maybe we can have some influence over is one of the things with special permits, and I can explain that for anyone who doesn't already understand it at this point. But one of the things with special permits, Jesse, is that it allows some flexibility with the zoning commission to impose conditions that otherwise wouldn't be able to be imposed on a regular site plan approval. And so some of the conditions maybe that we can ask for is that they take, measures that professionals would recommend to mitigate the impact on the wildlife, to make sure that it's not being disturbed at, breeding and nesting times or, however those cycles work.
Yeah, because that is where they nest. And talking about building a bridge over so folks can view, it's
Right.
just not a great spot for it. The other side of the pond would be much better for that. This is where they're kind of quiet and nesting and
Right,
they're safe
exactly.
zone. So,
Right.
so I appreciate others as well wanting to preserve that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse. And I will say too, for all the folks who are on here and may watch this afterwards, if you live on the Mill Pond on either side, we are appreciating the folks who are sending in pictures. And some folks have sent in pictures of, kind of different times of year. It would be good to see what the perspective is of what your view is now and how that might change with when that structure goes up. Okay, so we have some other hands up here.
Yes, we have Judy who's been waiting.
Okay.
To unmute her.
I watched the whole presentation online, and I had a couple of questions just looking at things. I don't know if they've been discussed. The entrance and exit to the parking lot seems to be at the worst possible place.
Mhm.
The parking that they're proposing, the street parking, I assume that's going to be parallel parking.
Mhm.
I don't know many people who know how to do parallel parking anymore. And it's going to block up traffic while people sort of rock back and forth trying to get in and out.
Mhm.
And I had to laugh when I saw the bike lanes. I mean, I don't know what the utility of bike lanes that go nowhere but just in front of the property.
Mhm.
Lastly, they kept talking about these buildings as if they were separate buildings. I assume these are just a series of facades on one big building.
Mhm.
And from that point of view, I think are we going to encounter the same type of problem that we had with the building, with the condos on, they're not condos, on Winfield, you know, that they changed the design?
Mhm.
And I think that's something we need to point out.
Mhm.
And finally, one thing I'm very concerned about is if there's inadequate parking, people are not going to frequent those storefronts, and we're going to get more empty storefronts like we already have along East Avenue. Is any of this going to be affordable housing? That's another thing.
Mhm. Okay, I'll wait and I'll take those, 'cause it sounds like people have questions, and for the ones that I can answer, I will. But we'll also be making, I'm jotting down now, we'll also be making a complete list of all the questions, especially because it's helpful to see the ones that are asked, repeatedly, because they tend to be the ones that folks are honing in on most concerned with. Is that all, Judy? And I can answer some of those, and then we'll.
One last question.
Mhm.
The Masons building, they were trying to sell off part of their property. Did they do that?
Mhm. Okay, so I'll take these one at a time. Thanks, Judy.
Well, my only question about
Yep.
that is it would be perfect to provide more parking for this, the project.
Mhm.
Because I think they have inadequate parking. All right, I'm done.
Okay, thank you. All right, guys, so I'll rattle down this list super quick. So the parking that's in front really, I think, took a lot of people by surprise, because the intent there actually is that Cemetery Street then would essentially become a single lane instead of the two lanes that veer off, going right to Gregory, to the beach, and then going left towards Rogers Square there. And then when you take that into account with with what would be parallel parking, and then the buffer for the bike lane, it would be pretty tight there. The way that I looked at it as well is that that would end up being parallel parking. I believe they said that those 10 spaces, though, they're not counting towards their 99 space requirement for the parcel itself, but I'm going to double check that. One of the concerns I have with that is that if that parking comes under the purview of the Norwalk Parking Authority, I think it's going to be troublesome for the area, in the same way that those parking regulations have hampered parking and patronizing businesses and restaurants in Sono and over on Wall Street and on Main Street as well. So we need to get a whole bunch more information on those parking spaces. I'm personally not in favor of parking there. I think they need to provide, if they're going to meet the requirement of having retail on that parcel, which, by the way, they have to do under the POD zone. So they're basically putting in just what they need to get by to comply with the zoning for the East Avenue Village Transit Zone. My feeling would be that they have to provide 100% of the parking for their facility on their facility. And I know other people will disagree with that, but I think it's the way to go so that we don't have this overflow parking. And that would be including whatever that retail is. I have concerns as well. We can talk about it later about where they've put that retail and the fact that it looks like it's basically stacked on one corner. I can't imagine what type of retail they'd be looking to put in there. And we need to see if they can elaborate on that. Judy, the egress, I agree, where they have it coming at the bend there. I think they said in the meeting that they have to revisit all of that as they get further into their traffic analysis. And they also have yet to get the information they need from the state of Connecticut. Because as you approach that bend, you're still technically on 136, until you actually hit Gregory. And so the state will look at this project as probably what they call a major traffic generator, and they'll do a whole study of what the traffic input would be there. So I'm not quite sure if that entrance and exit there will actually stay the same. You're correct about the series of facades. At one point, it looked like it was, it could be separate buildings, and so it wouldn't create what we were calling, canyonization of East Avenue. But it really is just a facade. It's kind of just, where they have the setbacks in between the four main facades. It's actually still one building. It's just one continuous building. There's a smaller building that's to the left of it, if you're looking at it from the cemetery, which will have some apartments and I believe office space there. But those large 3.5-story buildings are continuous. There's no access through and, no light coming through there. The design review that you referenced for not having to do the battle again, we just did at 93 Winfield. The good news is in the East Avenue Village Transit Zone, which this is, there is design review. And so that puts a lot more teeth into once they have a final design with, everything, including the architecture, the materials, the colors, etc., that they pretty much have to stick to that. That will have a little bit more teeth to it. Having said that, everything is subject to change in zoning. They just need to come back and ask for, cry hardship or, ask for a variance, and, things can change, but there's a little bit more teeth to it on East Avenue and in this zone than there is on 93 Winfield. Inadequate parking, I agree with that. I think they need to maintain within their parcel, the parking that they need for everything within their parcel, and not assume that that there's a percentage of the people that won't have a car at all. I mean, until that materializes anywhere in this city, I think we need to stick with the 1.3 spaces. They are required to have the affordability unit. They'll have workforce housing that's equivalent to 10% of the number of units there. And I wouldn't, the Mason Lodge building or excess property, they're looking to rezone so that can be turned into residential. And by doing that with the funding, they can completely renovate or partially renovate very badly needed in the lodge itself. I don't anticipate that becoming parking, and I think probably people would resist that becoming parking based on the need for housing and the fact that, we wouldn't want to have, parking there that basically, just supports, whatever Spinnaker is doing there. I'll add one more note to this, though, is one of the things that in the past we've gone to bat for, just kind of dropped it at this point, but we should go back, is the commuter parking lots for the East Norwalk train station. East Norwalk Neighborhood Association believes those lots should be opened up on weekends and evenings after 6, when they're least likely to be used by, heavy commuter volume, so that people can patronize the local restaurants in East Norwalk and some of the amenities that we have here. And we don't see any reason why, why that couldn't be done, and, to have it done as free parking. Okay. So hopefully that answered some of it, Judy, but we'll be throwing some of this back at the, not only at the applicant, but at some point very soon, probably now, we'll start formulating questions that come directly from the East Norwalk Neighborhood Association. We submit those into city staff. So it'll go into Steve Kleppen and his staff, and we'll submit those questions. And at some point, they'll kind of be the go-between between ENNA and Attorney Blank in terms of getting answers. And we'll get those answers all in writing, and hopefully descriptive and definitive answers. Okay. I really can't walk and chew gum at the same time, so I'm kind of watching. Charles, are you watching the chat as well, or?
Yeah, there's a
Okay.
bunch of comments there about the traffic and the amount of parking spaces for the building, and the 20 or so that are for retail or restaurant commercial use. but most of it's traffic. And of course, that was 3/4 of the meeting on
Right.
with Spinnaker, traffic concerns.
Mhm.
If I could just say one thing that made me raise an eyebrow, 19 minutes into the actual meeting, the developers showed a pro bono drawing of what they suggested for Fenwick, which was actually making a clearing for the developers to have more of a water view on Fenwick.
Right.
Now, again, with concerns to Mill Pond, this would even create more traffic and people to Mill Pond. So I don't know who they did the pro bono drawing for. They did not allude to that, but I found it very curious.
Mhm. Yeah, I think so they had two pieces in there. They had that drawing that comes at the end of Fenwick, where people presumably could walk, and then they would have some access to be able to to view the pond. And then you have the other piece, which is closer to the East Avenue side, which is the city property, and that's also the drawing that they ended up doing of that that kind of boardwalk that they had jutting out into the Mill Pond there, where the city property is. And that's the one where they said they had no intention of paying to do anything there, but where they would provide the right of way. And it'd be interesting to hear from any of the Fenwick folks who are on here as to what increased access and cleanup there would mean, with people driving on, or walking through down to the pond there. Maybe it's welcome. It does need some, I think, some tender love and care over there, but it is interesting. I think the other thing, I just saw somebody's comment in here. I just wanted to make a comment on here. Hang on one second. Something. Okay, now I'll put on my ENNA public advocate type hat here. One of the things that ENNA is particularly concerned with, and we're going to file something that, for lack of a better term, I'll call it a complaint, is the fact that this application went rapid fire from the time it came into the Planning and Zoning Office to the time that the Zoning Commission saw it. It was literally went into zoning on a Friday afternoon, and Steve Kleppen had it before the Zoning Commission the following Wednesday night. And he did that against our objections, with the reason that he gave us was that he needed to get it to the commission as soon as possible, because he needed their authorization to hire the third-party traffic consultant to review the applicant's traffic analysis. Because sometimes that review and the back and forth between the applicant and the third-party consultant can take some time. The consultant reviews it, they come up with a list of questions, they submit it to the applicant's attorney, they review it, they answer back, and there could be several, iterations going back and forth on the questions regarding how they came up with their traffic numbers. So my point here is that this thing had to be rushed through so that the consultant could be hired, so that they could immediately start their review of the traffic analysis from the applicant. Well, most of you probably have noticed by now, there's absolutely nothing posted or provided to the public of the traffic analysis from the applicant. So they are withholding those documents and reviewing everything behind closed doors, which it may comply with freedom of information to the letter of the law, because they're probably calling it a draft document or a working document. And most of those are exempt from freedom of information access. But the fact remains is that there really isn't anything in there that would be considered confidential, where they would be saying that we're not going to release it. And in every other application that comes before the city, I have never seen one that came before the city that didn't have the applicant's traffic analysis with it, whether or not a third party was required or desired to have the review. So folks should know right now that there's seriously something going on with how they're figuring out these traffic counts and traffic analysis and what it's going to do to East Avenue, what the level of service is going to be at some of our lights when they get through with this. There's a reason why we're not seeing this information, and people should be very concerned with it. And that's why ENNA is going to be filing an inquiry and at least a complaint that this thing was rushed through on June 15th, and now here we are on August 15th. So exactly 2 months later, and none of us have the benefit of seeing any traffic analysis on this. And I think, I'm not sure if he's on the call or not. I'm not sure if it was Lou last week who mentioned that this is yet another developer application where they are limiting their traffic analysis to the immediate periphery of their property, instead of going out to a broader number of intersections that are going to be impacted. And it's ridiculous for them to stop their traffic analysis at Winfield when we know that this development is going to definitely impact traffic that's going to head up East Avenue north to the highway and out to US 1. So, and when we do send this information in, we're going to see if we can at least get the original traffic analysis that the developer presented, and also see what they've given to the state so far. I went onto the state site this weekend to see if they've posted their review yet for this parcel, and there's nothing there yet. We also, one of the other things too with this application coming in on June 15th is, you guys may remember from past meetings and also from our emails, the statutory time clock for reviewing special permits, holding public hearings, and making final decisions starts, the clock starts from the time the application is filed with the zoning office. And this was filed on June 10th or whatever that prior Friday was. That actually started the statutory clock, counting down 65 days to a review and the start of the public hearing process. Now, the applicant can always extend that. And presumably, if they're up against the wall right now, because I think it'll be August 20th, presumably they're going to honor extending that and not try to force a public hearing within the next week. Clearly, they're not ready to go. They're not ready to go to public hearing. And someone on there too posted I think it's Bessie, that you can't turn around on Fenwick, and I think that's a point that they made too. That whatever gets done down there, they thought that they had to have access and turn around for emergency vehicles. And you're right, they don't own anything over there. Another curious thing too is that there, when we talk about Mill Pond, the developer, and this is true, the developer, just by virtue of eliminating even a small amount of the impervious surface, is going to have at least somewhat of a positive impact on the rainwater that goes into the Mill Pond. And for all the water that will still go in, because, it's still going to come off these buildings and et cetera, and from the parking lots, they will be doing mitigation to try to make the water that goes into the Mill Pond cleaner than it is today. And they're also going to be, in line with this, they'll be doing the work that would improve the sidewalk and the walkability along Cemetery on their side of the street there. But I want to point out two things, and I'm not sure if the developer is on here or not. It would be interesting if Mr. Descala is on here. If he is, I would like to get his input on this. The contaminated runoff that goes into the Mill Pond now, because we have the impervious surface of the bank sitting in an asphalt jungle there, to the best of my knowledge, in the forever years that the Descala entities have owned that property, I'm not aware that they did anything to mitigate the impact on Mill Pond in terms of the water quality, basically anything else that was going on there with the wildlife. I can also say where the sidewalks are not, are in disrepair, certainly not as bad as some other parts in East Norwalk, but the sidewalks in front of Wells Fargo also is their property. And I would say, again, when we're looking at promises from developers, none of us are fortune tellers. We can't tell what they're going to do or not do in the future, but we can certainly look back on historically what the owners of this property have done. And the sidewalks that are in disrepair, they have been in disrepair in the time that Mr. Descala has owned it. And to the best of my knowledge, I haven't seen any improvements done there on the parcel, either reducing asphalt or increasing canopy or improving the walkability at the sidewalk. We have a question too. Is anybody's hands up, Charles? I'm sorry, because I don't see everybody.
No, I don't see anybody's hands up.
Okay, so I finally got into chat here where I can read them, so I'll keep going, and then we can open up some more items on. I'd like to hear too from people who I see a couple of people on here I know for sure are excited to see this get started, and I'd like their input on what they hope this will bring, and some feedback from them on how this can be improved to make it, less undesirable from the folks who are really opposed. So a question came in from Judy: wasn't this advertised earlier at the senior retirement residence? We're not quite like that, Judy, but Mr. Descala, when he first developed this plan and when he shared part of it with ENNA and presumably with city staff, the goal was that these were going to be very high-end either rentals or townhouses that were going to be for a senior community, not as a retirement residence, but for basically snowbirds that wanted to downsize from the very large properties they have in Norwalk and elsewhere. Many of them, as I understood it, I think from him, belong to Shorehaven Country Club, etc., and wanted to be able to downsize as empty nesters, but to maintain a residence in Norwalk for where their family are or for where they have, other activities and amenities, and then to be able to winter down south. That was part of the reason a lot of people weren't particularly concerned about traffic. They weren't particularly concerned about the impact on the school system, etc. And so this is another, fairly major switch that we're seeing in the components of the size and type of units. And it does seem, I think they kind of danced around it again, but it does seem that the demographics have changed as well, which is why, at the end of the meeting, I said people are a little bit surprised because it's basically, nothing of what Mr. Descala had presented to us. I can also give you guys a heads up too, because this goes back many emails ago from ENNA. But you can expect the developers to come back in and probably seek approval again to try and change the name of Cemetery Street. Mr. Descala said that he's probably would go ahead and do that. I'm not sure. I don't think it came up in a question at last week's meeting. If it did, I don't recall. But I know that there was public outcry a couple of years ago when they attempted to do that the first time to, put a name on it that would lead to increasing their marketing ability. I believe they wanted to name it Mill Pond Place and rename Cemetery Street altogether. Okay, the question is, who are the lead attorneys representing the developers? It's Adam Blank out of Wolfsey. I'm sorry, I'll have to Google the name. It's a attorney's office out of Stanford. Adam Blank is a lead attorney representing them. And Adam Blank is he's a Norwalk resident. He's also the former chairman of the Norwalk Zoning Commission. Okay, a couple other things for folks to know as well is that there was some back and forth originally when the TOD zone as a whole was being designed for East Norwalk. And then again, when the East Avenue corridor portion of it, which comes from 95 all the way down to the Mill Pond, it's the actual village designation, that's the East Avenue Village Transit Zone. There was some deliberation back and forth about whether the Cemetery Street parcel would be included or if it would stop just shy of that, but then go around the corner to, like over to Ludlow Square, etc. And I think we can go back to Steve Kleppen, the Planning and Zoning Director, just to, get some information on why the final decision on it. But one of the concerns was that parcel could have been designated for 100% residential and kind of been blocked out of the EVTZ zone. And there would be no requirement for them to have a mixed use there. For example, the retail and or restaurant and or office. And so it seems that in order to get the maximum amount of units or nearly the maximum that they want to get, is that it was factored into the EVT zone so that could be accomplished. Something people should be aware of, and ENNA will make the Zoning Commission aware of this, is while this application was behind closed doors with the city, in other words, they hadn't filed it yet, but they were working with staff. It seems that that's probably the likely time that Steve Kleppen also made some changes to the EVTZ zone. And what those were, for people who were in this from the very beginning, you may recall that in order for a developer to be able to have the maximum 3.5 stories and the maximum number of units, the ground floor of those developments would have to be 100% activated. So either with retail, with service, with restaurant, etc. At some point, out of nowhere, zoning with Steve came back and said that they had reconsidered it. They talked to the consultants, they met with some developers, and they felt that was kind of onerous and it could be a burden and it might not, it may lead to empty storefronts, etc. And so what they decided was that where there was a parcel development that would be, on the corners of the village, of the neighborhood blocks, that only the end units on the ground floor would have to be activated, and that the balance of the ground floor could actually be residential. So when that change was going through, none of us had seen this application, and some of us, including myself, were wondering that, that was kind of a bizarre change to make out of nowhere, and it didn't seem to make sense because the goal is to have, an activated village district that ensured that it was mixed use and not just overwhelming number of residential units, right? So now fast forward to June when this application came in, and it seems pretty evident now with the design that Spinnaker showed you last week with retail on the East Avenue corner and then the retail and or office on the Gregory side, that was probably the new regulation, and that change very well could have been written specifically for this application. And whether you love or you hate this development, I would hope that most people find what I just said to be fairly disturbing. It tends to give credence to, what we basically know of these developments being completely designed behind closed doors. And by the time we see them, they have, dotted all the i's and crossed the t's, etc. There are some things with some possible deed restrictions and some land uses on that parcel, and ENNA is in the process of investigating those now, so that we can see if this little switcheroo that happened actually complies with what that parcel required before it was changed. Another thing too, folks should be aware of in terms of changes. Thank you, Judy. Yep, the attorney is Wolfsey, Rosen, Queskin, and Kuriansky in Stamford. Thank you for that. Another thing that was changed is that prior to the EVTZ zone, that parcel was designated NB as neighborhood business, and neighborhood business under the regulations required that there be public access to any waterway or water source or to the pond itself. And what we're being told, and was in a zoning meeting, was that when Steve Kleppen changed the zone to EVTZ, that particular parcel, which was the only one that abuts the water, he either neglected to, just as an oversight, put back in the requirement that the public must have access to the water there, or it was taken out deliberately and not made mention of until the zone was approved in January of this year. So while Spinnaker, it may appear that they're being generous by saying, well, we'll grant a right of way to the city to have public access behind our buildings, to have access to view the water. The fact of the matter is that, you know, our stance on that is probably going to be that they're required to do it. And we may look at putting in a request that the access actually come from the front of those buildings and do a redesign. People really, much in the same way that Mike DeScala's Head of the Harbor project down on Smith Street, where East Wall Street goes down to Wall Street, much in the same way that people don't realize there's public access to the waterway there at his building. I suspect it's going to be the same thing here. It's probably not going to be well indicated in terms of signage. And just the same way with Spinnaker's 230 East Avenue, even though that courtyard is designated as public realm, when you start to go into that property, it looks like you're on either private property of his or private property of the DOT. So you don't really feel like you can just go in there and, like, you know, and sit or, you know, go and use a table or whatever else might be out there. And I think that's going to be the same with the access in the back of the building. The other concern would be whose responsibility is it for lighting, for security, for noise mitigation, etc. Okay, the question mark came up with protected wetlands. There, at some point, Steve Kleppen had declared to zoning that he wasn't sure if it was considered water views or wetlands, etc. You know, obviously it is. I think the legal designation is tidal wetlands because of the tide cycle, and so it does have to go through the inland wetlands. I believe Attorney Blank at last week's meeting said that they are getting on the agenda of Inland Wetlands Agency, but they're not on it yet. I think they meet again the end of August, so I've been watching to see when that comes up on there. And in terms of protected wetlands, I think one of the issues is that they certainly can't do anything that would impact it in a negative way. And they're contending that everything they're doing is actually going to have a positive effect on the pond over the current use, which, you know, basically everybody objects to. And that's another good point. I mean, most people realize that massive parking lot with that little bank in the middle of it is not the best use of land by, you know, anybody's definition. Yep, the public access and the little park in the back is a concern for security and who's going to monitor it. And I think the idea of them having these buildings right up at the street is because of the slope of that land, they want to be able to maximize what they can do with the height and the grade coming down from the road. And they would be resistant at this point, probably at any point, to move everything back, make it smaller, separate the buildings, and have public realm in front that would be facing the cemetery, where people could sit, or maybe have, some outdoor activities, and have much more green space. And of course, there's already questions about, 78 units. If it's anything like 230 East Avenue, there's like virtually no respect of the neighborhood when it comes to people with dogs. And unless they're going to have, much more green space than what they're showing, people aren't going to have room to walk their dogs. I hope they're not going to be walking them in the cemetery and leaving, dog stuff behind, or, cleaning up and flinging dog, debris into Mill Pond, etc. But there's certainly not enough green space there on the property. Yep. So the full list of their amenities that they brought with us, we posted it in an ENNA email. We can post it again. It's very short, but it racked up their points very quickly, which is what we're afraid of. Some of their amenities are the public access with the park behind. There's some public seating. There's going to be a butterfly garden. There's two different types of rain gardens, and there's a couple of other minor things that are in there, but they racked up enough points to be able to do the density that they have at the 77 units. I think they could have actually done 78 with that. Let's see, Ben. Putting buildings right on the sidewalk makes the environment human scale. This project be a good step towards making East Norwalk somewhat walkable. I agree with that to some extent, depending on what they ultimately end up doing with the sidewalks and buffering from the car traffic. I'm still not keen on this idea of having parking on Gregory Boulevard and cutting that down on Cemetery Street and cutting that down to one lane. But putting the buildings right on the sidewalk, I'm not sure what you mean, Ben. Maybe you can hop on, we'll unmute you when you say makes the environment human scale. The fact is that the closer those buildings are to the sidewalk, the more dwarf you have people walking by, and it just looms over. And it creates the part of the canyonization that we were talking about. And we can illustrate that with some graphics as well. It would seem that it would be more walkable and less imposing if it were set back and you had some trees and you had a courtyard and you had the type of public realm that we first saw in the renditions of East Avenue, I would think. Can you elaborate? Here we go. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, no problem. I apologize in advance for how my voice sounds. I'm getting over a sickness, so I apologize for that. But I think the best way I could describe it is to look at Sono, right, where you've got all of the buildings right up on the sidewalk, and there's not really any setback on either side to speak of, and that makes the environment feel appropriately sized to walk around in. And on the other side of the spectrum, you could look at something like all of the strip malls on Route 1, where you've got these enormous stores set, hundreds of feet back from the road, and it's sized for cars. Mm-hmm. And it's not human scale. It's not enjoyable to walk around in. So, I'm not necessarily always opposed to putting amenities out in front, like public spaces out in front of a building. But I did say in the comments there, I've noticed that 50 Washington has a nice big lawn in front of it, but nobody really uses it. And I think in this case, for Mill Pond, it makes more sense to put that courtyard in the back than on the front. And on the front, you have a more human scale environment to walk in.
But, I appreciate that. And, it is a different, we like to hear all the different opinions. I just think the scale of it at 3.5 stories right up to the sidewalk, I think is more imposing than it is, kind of inviting. The idea wouldn't be like the strip malls are absolutely horrendous. Shame on, the approvals that allowed all of those to go in. But the idea wouldn't be parking. It would be, public plazas where they're activated, where there's seating, where there's fountains, where there's artwork. And that would be much more inviting. 50 Washington Street, I know, almost every time I'd been by there, and it's, not recent, had been activated. With concerts and with people sitting, and people having lunch and, etc. But, the fact that it's still in front of 50 Washington Street doesn't really do it any good. But I think here, my personal feeling, especially since it's anchored by the cemetery, I think it would be much more scale to fit in with the neighborhood if it was set back, and then you had a lot of green space and public amenities in the front. Ideally, I would want both, Ben. I would say, cut this thing back and have that type of beautiful front yard and area with seating and, like I said, water fountains and artwork and maybe activities there, and still be able to maintain something where people can go and have passive recreation in the back, just with a kind of a small observation deck, and I mean small. Looking out over the pond.
Yeah, I think they both have their place. And I know that East Norwalk doesn't really have a ton of that, like right on the sidewalk type of building style, the way that Sono does. But I think that's more to Sono's credit than anything else. I know that this project might be among the first in East Norwalk to look like that, but I think that we would be better served as a neighborhood to have more projects in that style.
Yeah, and I think the resistance at first was, one of the first things people said when this whole thing started is, we don't want to be Sono. And so the idea is to be, completely opposite of that, especially where you're looking at both Washington Street and actually Water Street now too. So, and I think that's the uniqueness of East Norwalk. It's funny you mentioned with the setback with just green lawn and maybe a couple of benches, because there was great controversy in the beginning of TOD with Steve Kleppen saying that St. Thomas School property was an eyesore. And while Spinnaker was quick to point out last week that it is like, one level going across and it's not broken up, and it's funny that Bruce Beinfeld would be involved with something where he's calling somebody else's project prison-like. I find that comical. But one of the things that the folks in East Norwalk proper love about St. Thomas Church property is that setback with the green lawn there, and that that it is back from the road, and we have. As you're walking along, you have the wider sidewalk and you have the green there. Not everyone loves it, but it's just really interesting of the comparison of Sono and what most people desire here versus the scale of Sono.
Yeah, and obviously Sono's got its own vibe, right, with all the restaurants and the bars.
Yep.
And I'm not saying that East Norwalk necessarily needs to have that, but just in terms of the walking experience, even up by St. Thomas and further up East Avenue, it's a lot more kind of loud and in your face with all the cars, right? I live just across from the Wells Fargo, and I'll walk up to the Rite Aid or something, and it's just so noisy, and there's cars flying past all the time.
Yeah. And then again, can you imagine that? And then having a building right at the sidewalk, right to your left shoulder.
10
feet in, I'd be like, and the car is zooming by. Because when the road gets widened and straightened out, it's, it's going to be a speedway, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would argue that with the buildings being closer up to the sidewalk, it kind of makes the whole area feel more enclosed, and drivers are actually less comfortable speeding in an environment like that. Because you're right that whole stretch of East Avenue is very sort of low and straight and wide, and you can just fly. So I know this is getting a little bit out of the scope of just the Mill Pond development, but all along East Avenue, I'd love to see traffic calming and other measures to really get people to slow down, and much more robust pedestrian amenities. And I think that would really pay a lot of dividends for the neighborhood, to allow more people to visit local businesses and just make it a nicer place to spend time.
Okay. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. So what I want to explain here is that this is a special permit application. And they have to they're required to comply with all of the zoning regulations that are in the new zone, the East Avenue Village Transit Zone. One of the things that folks really have to understand, and I know that it makes it difficult and it can be disappointing, but once an application meets all the technical requirements of the zoning requirements and of the building requirements as well, there's nothing that's within the power of the zoning commission to deny an application. And so unless there's some technical error, if there's something that doesn't comply with some small section of the zoning code, then it can be denied or it can be reworked and resubmitted, etc. But assuming that what Spinnaker has submitted actually complies with the zoning regulation for this new zone, and folks, you have to assume it does because they've been vetting this for months with staff, working every little detail to make sure that they haven't missed anything that could come back to haunt them here. So assuming that it meets all the technical requirements to comply with zoning, the special permit does allow for some consideration for the quality of life of the neighborhood. And special permits do that in a couple of different ways. One of the most important ways is that under the law, a special permit application must require at least one public hearing. And so there are a number of other types of applications that don't even require a public hearing. And so we never really get to go before the zoning commission in the way that we do with a formal legal hearing. But for a special permit, they're required to have a public hearing. And again, at this point, we have no idea how quickly or how delayed that might be. The other thing about special permits is that it's the one area of Connecticut law that allows a zoning commission to consider other items besides the actual strict zoning code compliance. And in this case, special permits allow a zoning commission and a planning commission, because now they're combined, the planning and zoning commission, they can consider 13 different sets of quality of life issues and how a development or an application can impact the surrounding area. We've posted these repeatedly in emails, and we'll post them again so that folks can look at them. But if you're concerned about this application and you want to speak to things that the zoning commission is going to actually take into account, they're basically only going to take into account these 13 items that you see here, lettered A through K. There's actually, I'm sorry, K through M. I mean, A through M. Again, once it complies with zoning, these are the only other things that they're going to take into account. And we call them the 13 special permit conditions and safeguards that they can review. Speaking at the public, at a public hearing and talking about things that the zoning commission isn't going to consider at that point. Again, things like, turning it into a public park, things like that. They're not going to take that into account, because what this developer has applied for, they have a right to apply for it, and they've applied in a manner that complies with exactly what the zone requires. And in fact, in this case, they've actually applied for something that, for all intent and purposes, was almost specifically written for them for this particular parcel. So we can just all kind of let that go. If there's any legal technicalities regarding the parcel, then hopefully we'll dig those up sooner rather than later, just so that we can make sure that we have every opportunity to be able to work with the developer to get the type of development there that's not going to be as objectionable. So anyway, I'm just going to run through these super quick and then answer any questions on these. So the first one is probably the most important one. So the zoning commission can take into account these different criteria. And what happens is that, I'll read this line right here. A special permit may be granted after the determination by the commission that the proposed use or structure is in harmony and intent of these regulations. Now, if they stopped right there, there'd probably be a whole lot of objectionable applications that would never have gone through. But you have to read the next line, the next part of the sentence here. It has to be within the proposed use or structure in harmony with the general purpose and intent of these regulations, and after consideration of the following conditions where applicable. Now, what does that mean? What it means is that there could be something objectionable in one or more of these 13 criteria. But as long as the developer can do something to remedy it that would meet a condition imposed by the zoning commission, they can still approve it. So the fact that something in here might be objectionable and undesirable by the neighborhood, as long as the developer can remedy it by adhering to a zoning imposed condition, then the zoning will still approve it. Okay, I hope that's clear to everyone, but raise your hand and I'll come back if it's not. Okay, so what do we have here? These are the only things they can take into account. The density of use and the bulk of the buildings. Well, obviously, in this case, that is a major item, because most people do not want to have something that's both as large or as densely populated as this structure. Now, they can take a look at that and determine that it does comply with the regulations because of the bonus amenity points, and therefore they can agree that the density of use and the bulk of the buildings is appropriate. Stable traffic flow shall mean that the site-generated traffic shall not adversely affect pedestrian or vehicular traffic. It shouldn't decrease the level of service that they would consider unacceptable. Well, stable traffic flow is what they have to prove when they finally turn over the traffic analysis to show that traffic is not impeded or changed from having to wait at a red light for 1 minute to changing to having to wait for 3 minutes, let's say. And then what is considered acceptable for the level of service? You see the words here are written as considered acceptable by the commission. So there's no standard that they have to adhere to. It's basically subjective. They can say, yeah, it's going to impact, waiting at the light at, Fitch and East Avenue or Winfield and East Avenue. People are going to have to wait a little bit longer because of the increase in volume. But we think that's acceptable given the overall benefit of having this development here. So that's another one that people can speak to in terms of, why they can't put any condition on there that would make that acceptable. The availability of mass transit, that goes without saying because it's part of TOD, it's at the train station, it's on a major bus route, etc. If people think that there's not proper clearance of the sidewalk then like, for example, many of us don't think a 5-foot wide sidewalk without obstruction is actually wide enough. The standard for new developments for site plan review in the city is actually 7 feet. So it's one of the things that we may be able to, if people want it, we may be able to convince the commission to put a condition in that says that the sidewalks on the property must be 7 feet with no obstructions, meaning, telephone poles and, garbage disposal, etc. Availability and compatibility of utilities. That one is interesting because does it take into account that they're just talking about water and electricity and cable and gas and things? Or does it also take into account services such as city sewer? And that's something we can talk about at an upcoming meeting, given some reports that just came out on the city sewer system, and what's getting dumped is raw sewage into the river all the time, into the sound. Another one people can focus on is adverse impact from noise, odor, fumes, dust, and artificial lighting. Again, as long as the commission can impose conditions on them that mitigate the adverse impact, then they may find it appropriate to approve it. But it would certainly be up to the community to raise their concerns with with all of these. I would say to the folks that live on Mill Pond to be particularly aware of not just the noise, but also the lighting as well. Signs, I don't think there's going to be any issue with their signage. If they needed to do signs that were larger than what the current code is, they have to come back for a variance on that. And then another important one is the adequacy of yards and open space and the screening and buffering from abutting neighbors. And so, we'll leave it to folks who are evaluating this in the community to decide for yourself if the amount of yard space, open space, and screening and buffering is adequate. And if you don't think it is, then you should voice your opinion on that. And the commission certainly has been known many times in the past to put conditions in for extra screening for both screening for site, screening for noise, and screening for light pollution. And in terms of the adequacy of the yards and the open space, you can speak to, people with pets, people with children, and just to have, open space for residents to enjoy. The impact on the neighborhood properties as compared to uses and structures permitted. Well, normally what a good attorney like Attorney Blank will do is they will take out the list of everything that could go there as of right within the zone, and they'll normally point to things that would be much more objectionable than a 3.5-story, 2-building, 77-unit residential structure. We normally contend that those other applications aren't before the city, and so it's irrelevant. The one that's before the city is this one, and that's the one that they should be considering what this impact of this development is on this community now. The existing land use in the area, because the zone was changed, certainly the residents can point to the fact that we don't have anything of that scale in East Norwalk, and the commission and city staff who will be proponents of this application and the attorney will point out that the very design of EVTZ zone was to encourage exactly this type of development. And again, it's likely that much of the code that we ended up with was written specifically for one cemetery street. So the argument there will be made that to them it's irrelevant of the existing land use, and that this is what their goal has been all along. And in fact, you could also argue too, if we look at some of the existing land use we all think is objectionable. I think most people agree we don't need one more gas station, for example, in the village center there. Proximity of community facilities just has to do with, houses of worship and recreational facilities, etc. And retail and dining and, things within the community, maybe senior centers and civic centers, etc. And then finally, or not finally, but the compliance with the zoning code and the plan of conservation and development. We already know it complies because I've gone over it with a fine-tooth comb, and it was adopted. The EVTZ zone was adopted into the plan of conservation and development and fully approved in January of this year. Another big one is conservation of wetlands, watercourses, and other ecologically valuable lands. This is where the debate comes in about just what the impact is going to be on Mill Pond. Is it going to be positive? Is it going to be neutral, or is it going to be negative? And what does it do to the not just the wetlands themselves, but to the wildlife and the habitat that's there? Mention again here, we really need some volunteers to help with research and working on some of these issues. And if we get to the point where we're funding to consult with a land use attorney, we'll need some people to help with that as well. Not just funding it, but to to help us to coordinate that and to have meetings and to work with an attorney to put together any of the points in a case that we might want to raise from a legal point of view, if it comes to that. And then finally, one that you can almost assume that somebody's already checked into, but sometimes it just slips through the cracks, is that the zoning commission will have to take into account whether there's any existing zoning violations on the property. And every once in a while, they'll get right to the point of public hearing, and then something will come up where there's a zoning violation that's been on the books and never remedied. And then those just simply, get a commitment that they'll remedy whatever violations exist before they actually, pull their building permits. There's a question on Brum and Crown. No, they don't use all of their parking. They have an agreement with the parking authority for a split between parking that is for Brum and Crown and then parking that's controlled under the parking authority with rates that are controlled by the for the commuter parking spaces over there. Interesting discussion on how that was all divvied up, and we can talk about that another night. We don't have time to do that, but it'd be interesting to see what percentage is used over there. And that's part of the reason why, we would want to have these commuter parking spaces opened up for supporting the businesses at nights and on nights and weekends. Yes, Scott, the way those cars would be is the pedestrians would be having a wall of cars, and folks that support that idea actually consider it a buffer. The cars act as a buffer between bicyclists and pedestrians, the cars themselves, and a lot of cities do employ that versus using like green buffer space with planters and trees and things like that. The interesting thing with the lane change on Gregory Boulevard is, that's coming from the developer and the city doesn't approve it. Although it's, be hard to believe that they haven't already approved all of this again, is, what that's going to mean for Gregory Boulevard traffic in the summer at the height of beach season and the fireworks, the boat show, the oyster fest, the dog show, etc. Okay, there's a question on here about whether or not they would end up privatizing access to the pond. They can, once the right of way is there, they can't actually, privatize it. That's where the debate comes in about why Steve Pepin, either as an oversight or deliberately took out the required access to the pond. But they certainly could come back at some point and say that that it's a security issue, or there's been, vandalism, or there's, drinking and drugs, or, stuff going on, and then come back and maybe look to close it down. I'm not sure what could be put in there that could say that it has to just stay as public access in perpetuity, unless they wrote it in that way. Yep. And then in terms of the retail, and even with the residents and stuff, Scott was mentioning something in here too. When they take into account their traffic information, and this is why we're eager to get our hands on what they're hiding from us, they need to take into account not just the residential traffic in and out, but they need to take into account delivery trucks, Amazon Prime, food delivery, Uber and shared drive pickups, garbage and recycling that could be multiple times a week, people moving in and out with those types of deliveries, etc. So those things should be taken into account, and we'll certainly raise them if that isn't in there. Okay, I'm just scrolling quickly through the rest of the chat comments. I think the other point too that folks can talk about in terms of the architecture is the fact that Mike Descala had promised, maritime, nautical, Nantucket, and this really doesn't look like it. And Colin Grothier, the architect for Beinfeld, made reference multiple times to replicating the theme that's down at the Norwalk Green, to carry that forward. But of course, as people have pointed out now a couple of times, we're not the Norwalk Green. And actually, I'll remind him of that too, because there were multiple times that he referred to the East Norwalk Historic Cemetery as the Green, which is it's not the Green or a Green. It's actually a historic cemetery there. Does ENNA have a position regarding the traffic realignment on Gregory? At this point, unless we hear something different, we would be opposed to that. We think there's some other traffic calming that can be done for people whizzing around there. I have to say, when I had my own little sports car, I tried to do my own personal best sometimes, just kind of hanging the left coming around the bend there. And but I think that there could be other creative traffic calming measures that are taken there that don't actually cut that down to one lane, and then have our parking authority kind of take control of parking there. That, I think that's going to be bad news to have that parking there. And then, yes, there's a comment on people agree with mixed use being vibrant. It was the intent of what we were looking at for TOD to begin with. For folks who aren't familiar with the original ENNA sentiment on that, we really wanted it to be focused right around the village there at the train station, and to be more activated there with mixed use, with retail, service, restaurant, professional, and residential. And then it just kind of went into something much bigger than that. Okay, I'm going to take one quick look here, and then we'll be following up with emails and trying to figure out the next steps. And if I don't see anybody else's hand up here, I'm just going to go back to the, I don't see anybody else's hand. I'm just going to go back, if I can, to the agenda, and I'm going to just, for the few folks who are left on here, let me just bring up the slide that shows you who you can start writing into now. And I think my screen is up there. So if you had questions or comments, concerns, suggestions, and you didn't speak up here, or we didn't see your hand, or you think of something afterwards when you watch their presentation or our meeting, you can always email into ENNA. Our email is info@eastnorwalk.org. You can, ahead of a public hearing, start submitting your comments, suggestions, questions, and concerns to the city. And you can do that to Steve Kleppen, who's the Director of Planning and Zoning, or start submitting stuff into the Planning and Zoning Commission because they are already reviewing this application. You cannot communicate directly with the Planning and Zoning Commission in Norwalk. So those emails also, though, go in care of Steve Kleppen. And you'll want to open it by asking Mr. Kleppen to share your comments with the P&Z Commission, if that's what you intend to do. And by sending comments in now, it does not preclude you by participating in the public comment. Steve Kleppen is skleppen@norwalkct.org. For those concerned with the wetlands and the wildlife and conservation issues there, this is going to come before the Inland Wetlands Agency. The person in charge there that reports into Steve, by the way, is Alexis Carachetti, and her email here is acarachetti@norwalkct.org. If you're writing these down, don't worry, we'll post them again. And then the developers themselves, at the end of last week's meeting, of course, they invited folks to communicate directly with them, which you're welcome to, and we encourage you to. And you can send the same thing, questions, comments, concerns, and suggestions into their formal development name is Mill Pond Holdings. It's the joint effort between Spinnaker and MF Descala Builders. And Matt Edwardson is the contact point, and he is matt@spinrep.com. And then finally tonight, just a reminder, as for right now, we are still going to be doing meetings on an as-needed basis. They may be monthly or more frequent now as we dig more into this application. And certainly if any other applications come in the near future, you can get more information and visit us on our website at eastnorwalk.org. We also try to post on Facebook, Instagram, and nextdoor.com and keep people updated there. But in order to get our meeting links and most of our videos and everything, you do have to be on our email list. So please share that with your neighbors to get them to sign up. And then we, again, are always looking for people to help. If you want to walk around flyers or petitions or write letters, send emails, speak up at meetings, help to coordinate documents, do research, the need is almost endless. And if you're able to volunteer to help us, or if you'd like to be considered to join the board as well, we'd like to have more board members and certainly a diverse board as well. And you can email us for that too at info@eastnorwalk.org. Okay, we have one more thing in chat, I think, and just people saying thank you. So I'll just say you're welcome. We hope this provides a public service. We really hope to do this where people are more engaged. I know it's a little bit harder in Zoom than when we are all over at the Marvin, but I hope that looking to meet with the new executive director over at the Marvin next week and have a conversation. And hopefully out of that, we can talk about meeting back in person over there and then talking with our technical folks to see how we can make that happen and have some hybrid meetings so that people can attend and participate in whatever manner is most comfortable to them. And then I'll close by saying thank you to all of you, the folks who attended and the folks who are still on, for caring about East Norwalk and being willing to learn about processes and the things that are going to impact us, and for speaking up with the things that you like and the things that you think need improvement, because the city needs to hear from us and not operate in a vacuum where it's just the the applicants for this new zone and no consideration for the residents. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a great night, and we'll be posting in emails, and we'll post this video as soon as we have it ready. If you haven't seen the Spinnaker presentation, it is posted on our website, so you can go there now and get it, or you can email us and I'll send you the link and you can watch it at your leisure. Thanks. Thanks, Louisa. Good night, everybody.